In the cold, gray dawn of a Tokyo prison, a man waits for the end. The air in his cell in Sugamo prison is stagnant with the smell of damp stone and despair. Outside, the world is still tearing itself apart in the final, convulsive years of the Second World War, a conflict he helped to shape from the shadows. To the guards who bring him his meager meals, he is prisoner number 743, a condemned foreign spy. To the German diplomats who once drank and laughed with him in the opulent embassy lounges, he was a charming, witty, and impeccably Nazi journalist named Richard Sorg. But in the silent chamber of his own mind, stripped of all artifice, he is something else entirely, a ghost. He is a man betrayed not by his enemies, but by the very cause to which he had sacrificed his soul, a cause that now refused to even speak his name. He gave the Soviet Union the world, and, in return, it gave him nothing. Not rescue, not acknowledgement, not even a bullet, just a long, drawn-out silence that was more damning than any executioner's verdict. How does a man reach such a state? How does a decorated hero of the German Empire, a man who shed his blood in the trenches of the First World War, become the most devastatingly effective spy in the history of the Soviet Union, only to be disowned and left to rot? This is not merely a story of espionage, of secret codes and clandestine meetings. It is a story of radical transformation, of a man so disgusted by one world that he dedicated his life to building another, even as the personal cost eroded his very being. It is a tragedy of ideology, a cautionary tale written in invisible ink and sealed with a hangman's knot, exploring the brutal, unforgiving calculus of a world where loyalty is a weapon, and the men who wield it are ultimately disposable. To understand the ghost in Sugamo prison, we must first go back to the beginning, to the forces that forged the man before the spy. Richard Sorg was born in 1895 in the Russian Caucasus, in the oil-rich city of Baku, a melting pot of cultures simmering on the edge of the vast Russian Empire. His father was a German mining engineer, his mother a Russian woman. This mixed heritage placed him at a crossroads of identity from birth, a man belonging to two worlds but fully at home in neither. It was a schism that would define his life. Raised in the affluent suburbs of Berlin, he was, by all appearances, a model son of Wilhelmine Germany. He was steeped in German culture, educated in German schools, and when the Great War erupted in 1914, he answered the call of the fatherland with the patriotic fervor expected of his generation. He volunteered, eager to prove his loyalty on the battlefield. The war, however, was not the glorious adventure promised by the propaganda posters. It was a meat grinder. On the Western Front, Sorg witnessed the industrial-scale slaughter that chewed up men and spat out broken shells. He was a good soldier, brave and committed, earning the Iron Cross for his valor. But the mud, the gas, and the ceaseless artillery barges began to hollow him out. In April 1916, his body was shattered by shrapnel. A single explosion broke both of his legs and mangled his hand. The wounds were horrific. Doctors saved his life, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, a permanent, aching reminder of the war's futility. It was during his long, painful convalescence that the true transformation occurred. Lying in military hospitals, surrounded by the maimed and the dying, he had time to think, to read, and to feel the deep, simmering rage of a generation betrayed. He consumed the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and in their revolutionary theories, he found an answer to the senseless carnage he had endured. He came to see the war not as a clash of nations, but as a squalid conflict between competing capitalist empires, fought by working-class men for the profit of aristocrats and industrialists. His patriotism curdled into a profound and lasting hatred for the system that had sent him to die. The German soldier was dead. In his place, a fervent, dedicated communist was born. After the war, Sorg threw himself into the cause with the same zeal he had once reserved for the Kaiser. He earned a doctorate in political science, but his real work was in the streets and in the clandestine meetings of Germany's fledgling Communist Party. He was an agitator, a journalist for leftist publications, a man whose sharp intellect was now a weapon aimed at the heart of the Weimar Republic. His passion and intelligence did not go unnoticed. By the early 1920s, he had come to the attention of the Comintern, the Soviet-controlled international organization of communist parties. And from there, it was a short step to the 4th Department of the Red Army Staff, the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. They saw in him the perfect raw material for a spy. He was a genuine German intellectual, a decorated war veteran with a doctorate. He could move in circles closed to others. He was a true believer, driven not by money, but by an unshakable ideological conviction. He was sent to Moscow for training, where he was polished into a formidable instrument of Soviet policy. The answer to that question could mean the difference between survival and annihilation for the Soviet state. Sorge's mission was to build a spy ring from scratch, penetrate the highest levels of power, and become Stalin's eyes and ears in the heart of the Japanese Empire. To do this, he needed a flawless cover. He couldn't be Richard Sorge, the known communist agitator. He had to reinvent himself, burying his past so deeply it could never be found. With the GRU's help, he crafted a new identity. He became a respectable, globe-trotting journalist. More than that, he embraced the mask of his ideological enemy. He joined the Nazi Party. It was a move of breathtaking cynicism and brilliance. As a card-carrying member of the NSDAP, writing for influential German newspapers like the Frankfurter Zeitung, he was above suspicion. He could openly seek out sources in the German community, socialize at the embassy, and profess his admiration for the Führer, all while serving the Kremlin. He arrived in Tokyo in 1933, a charismatic, hard-drinking, womanizing intellectual with a limp and a plausible backstory. He was the perfect mole, hiding in plain sight. In Tokyo, Sorge began the patient, meticulous work of building his network. This was not a task for a reckless man, but for a master of human psychology. He possessed an almost supernatural charm, a magnetic personality that drew people to him. He could debate philosophy, analyze military strategy, tell a good joke, and listen with an intensity that made people feel they were the only person in the world. He used this charisma to cultivate his two most important assets. The first was Hatsumi Ozaki, a respected Japanese journalist and intellectual who had secret communist sympathies and, crucially, was a close advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister. Ozaki provided Sorge with unparalleled insight into the thinking of the Japanese cabinet. The second was Max Clausen, a fellow German and dedicated communist, who served as the ring's indispensable radio operator, transmitting Sorge's intelligence to Moscow in painstakingly coded messages. Together with a handful of other sources, they formed the Sorge Ring, one of the most successful espionage networks of the 20th century. Sorge's primary target was the German embassy. He quickly befriended the military attaché, who was soon promoted to ambassador, Eugen Ott. I was completely captivated by Sorge. He saw a brilliant, well-connected journalist and a loyal Nazi who could provide him with invaluable analysis of the complex Japanese political scene. Sorge became Ott's confidant, his drinking buddy, his unofficial advisor. He was given a desk at the embassy, free rein to read classified diplomatic cables, and an open invitation to every important function. He was, in effect, running his own intelligence operation from inside the nerve center of Nazi Germany's diplomatic mission in Asia. The irony was staggering. The German ambassador was confiding his deepest secrets to Stalin's master spy. Sorge even began a brazen affair with Ott's wife, a dangerous game that spoke to a deep-seated recklessness that was beginning to fester beneath the charming exterior. The pressure of living this double life was immense and corrosive. The constant fear of a slip of the tongue, a misplaced document, or a suspicious glance from the wrong person was a heavy burden. To cope, Sorge drank. He drank prodigiously, earning a reputation as a charismatic but dangerously heavy drinker. His evenings were a blur of whiskey, sake, and endless parties. On one occasion, roaring drunk on his motorcycle, he crashed directly into a wall outside the American embassy, barely surviving. This public persona of a reckless bon vivant was, in part, a perfect element of his cover. No one would suspect such a loud, boisterous man of the discipline required for espionage. But it was more than an act. It was a release valve for the intolerable stress of his existence. The alcohol and the string of casual, often dangerous, affairs are the manifestations of a slow psychological decay. The lines between the spy's performance and the man's reality were dissolving. He was playing with fire, not just professionally, but personally, becoming a caricature of the dissolute European journalist he pretended to be. His value to Moscow, however, was undeniable. Throughout the late 1930s, he sent a steady stream of high-grade intelligence back to the GRU. He warned of the anti-Comintern pact between Germany and Japan. He provided detailed reports on Japanese military strength and economic capacity. But his greatest and most crucial intelligence came in 1941. As Hitler amassed his forces on the Soviet border, Sorg, through his access to the German embassy and his sources in the Japanese government, learned the unthinkable. He sent an urgent message to Moscow. Germany would invade the Soviet Union. He even provided the probable date, June 22nd. His warning was one of many that reached Stalin's desk. But the Soviet dictator, pathologically suspicious and convinced Hitler would not betray their non-aggression pact, dismissed them all. This is a stool pigeon who set himself up with some factories in Japan. Stalin reportedly scoffed, a chilling indictment of the paranoia that gripped his regime. Sorg, the man on the ground, could only watch in horror as his direst prediction came true. The German invasion was a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. The Red Army was shattered, and the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Russian territory, reaching the very gates of Moscow. The fate of the USSR hung by a thread. In this desperate moment, Stalin needed an answer to the question that had haunted him for years. What would Japan do? If the Japanese army attacked Siberia, the Soviet Union would be forced to fight a two-front war it could not possibly win. The pressure on the Sorg ring became almost unbearable. Sorg worked frantically, leveraging every contact, every source. His confidant, Hatsumi Ozaki, gained access to the minutes of the Imperial Conference where Japan's ultimate strategy was decided. The information he passed to Sorg was monumental. Japan had made its decision. It would not strike north against the Soviets. Its ambition lay to the south, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. On October 14, 1941, Max Clausen transmitted Sorg's most important message. It was a simple, definitive statement. The Japanese Guandong Army in Manchuria was not preparing for an attack on the USSR. They were turning south. When this intelligence reached Stalin, this time he listened. It was the confirmation he needed. Convinced that his Eastern Front was secure, he made one of the most pivotal decisions of the war. He ordered the transfer of more than a dozen battle-hardened, winter-equipped elite divisions from Siberia and the Far East all the way to the Western Front. These fresh, skilled troops arrived just in time to lead the counteroffensive that halted the German advance at the gates of Moscow in the brutal winter of 1941. Richard Sorg, the spy the Kremlin had scorned just months earlier, had saved the Soviet Union. It was his greatest triumph. It was also his last. Even as his intelligence was turning the tide of the war, the net was closing around him. The Japanese secret police, the dreaded Kempeitai, and its counter-espionage division, the TACO, were not fools. For months, they had been picking up faint, clandestine radio signals. They knew a spy ring was operating in Tokyo, but they didn't know who was in it. Their investigation was a slow, methodical process of elimination. They began by watching known Japanese communists and sympathizers. In early October 1941, they arrested an associate of Hatsumi Ozaki. Under torture, the man broke. He gave up Ozaki's name. On October 15th, just one day after Sorg sent his fateful message about Japan's southern strategy, the TACO arrested Ozaki. The first domino had fallen. Sorg heard the news of Ozaki's arrest, but his legendary confidence, now curdled into pure arrogance, betrayed him. He had survived for so long, had taken so many risks, that he believed himself to be untouchable. He was a prominent German journalist, a friend of the ambassador, a member of the Nazi Party. He He was convinced the Japanese would never dare to touch him. He made no effort to flee, no attempt to destroy his incriminating materials. It was his final, fatal mistake. On the morning of October 18, 1941, 3 days after Ozaki's arrest, plainclothes officers from the Taco appeared at his door. The charming mask fell away in an instant. The game was over. The suave intellectual was confronted with the grim, unadorned reality of his failure. As they searched his home, they found all the proof they needed. Microfilm documents, a list of his contacts, even a membership card for the Nazi Party, right next to damning evidence of his communist activities. The two worlds he had kept so violently separate had finally collided. The arrest of Richard Sorg sent a shockwave through Tokyo. The German embassy was thrown into a state of panic and profound embarrassment. Ambassador Ott, who had trusted Sorg implicitly, was disgraced and recalled to Berlin. His career was over. For Sorg and his collaborators, the world shrank to the confines of a prison cell and an interrogation room. The Taco were patient and methodical. Sorg, knowing his life was forfeit, decided to talk. But he controlled his confession with the same skill he had used to control his network. He admitted everything, laying out the entire history of his operation in meticulous detail. His Japanese interrogators were astonished by the scope and success of his work. But he was careful to frame his activities in a specific way. He claimed to have been working solely for the Comintern, the international political body, not the GRU, the instrument of the Soviet state. It was a final, desperate act of loyalty, an attempt to give the Soviet Union plausible deniability and protect it from a diplomatic firestorm with its supposed neutral neighbor, Japan. He took full responsibility, hoping to shield his masters one last time. He and his collaborators were tried and convicted of espionage. Sorg and Ozaki were sentenced to death. They were transferred to the notorious Sugamo prison to await their fate. And there, Sorg waited. For 3 long years, he sat in his cell, a pawn in a silent, high-stakes diplomatic game. The Japanese government, seeing his value, made a quiet offer to the Soviet Union. They were prepared to trade Richard Sorg for a Japanese spy held by the Russians. It was a standard procedure in the cold-blooded world of espionage. A simple exchange. Sorg had given Stalin the information that saved Moscow. His value had been proven beyond any doubt. He had every reason to expect his government to bring him home. The reply from Moscow never came. Or rather, it came in the form of a deafening, soul-crushing silence. The Soviet Union officially denied any and all knowledge of him. To the Japanese inquiry, the response was unequivocal. The man Richard Sorg is unknown to us. He had been cast out, disowned, erased. For the state he had served with such fanatical devotion, he had become a non-person. The reasons were a cold calculation of Stalinist paranoia and political expediency. To admit Sorg was their spy would be to admit they had been conducting espionage against a neutral Japan, potentially provoking the very conflict Sorg had worked so hard to prevent. Furthermore, in Stalin's eyes, captured spies were failures. They were tainted. It was easier, cleaner, to simply abandon him. For Sorg, languishing in his cell, this betrayal must have been a crueler blow than any sentence of death. The ideology to which he had dedicated his entire adult life, for which he had sacrificed his health, his identity, and his freedom, had declared that he did not exist. The end came on November 7th, 1944. The date was deliberately chosen by his Japanese captors. It was the 27th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the founding day of the state that had forsaken him. It was a final, symbolic twist of a knife. Sorg was led from his cell to the gallows. He remained composed, walking with the familiar limp that had followed him since the trenches of the First War. His final words, shouted in Japanese, were a testament to the faith he kept even after it had abandoned him. The Red Army, the Comintern, the Soviet Union, he cried out just before the trapdoor sprang open. Hatsumi Ozaki was executed the same day. The ghost of Sugamo prison was finally laid to rest, buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery. For 2 decades, Richard Sorg remained a non-person in the Soviet Union. His name was scrubbed from the records. His sacrifice was unacknowledged. He was a dangerous secret, a reminder of a complex and embarrassing chapter of the Great Patriotic War. But history has a long memory. In 1964, 20 years after his execution, the political winds in Moscow shifted. Nikita Khrushchev, in his campaign of de-Stalinization, was looking for heroes whose stories could be used to subtly critique the paranoia and brutality of the Stalinist era. Suddenly, Richard Sorge was resurrected. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. The spy they had abandoned was now a celebrated icon. Streets were named after him, postage stamps were printed with his face, and films were made leonizing his exploits. The state that had denied his existence now claimed him as its greatest martyr. This posthumous rehabilitation created a powerful, yet deeply dishonest, myth. The image of Sorge the communist superhero, the flawless agent of the people, became official state propaganda. It was a narrative that conveniently ignored the messier, more human truths of his story. It erased the profound recklessness, the alcoholism, the psychological decay born from a life of deception. Most critically, it papered over the supreme act of cynical betrayal, the Kremlin's refusal to save him. The polished public image of the state-sanctioned hero stood in stark, irreconcilable contrast to the private reality of the lonely man left to die by the very people he had saved, whose last words were a defiant cry of loyalty to a regime that no longer knew his name. The story of Richard Sorge is therefore more than a spy thriller. It is a profound and somber meditation on the nature of belief and betrayal. He was a man of immense talent and conviction, a true believer in a cause he thought would build a better world. He mastered the dark arts of espionage, of deception and manipulation, and used them to achieve one of the greatest intelligence victories of the war. But he was also a flawed and tragic figure, slowly consumed by the pressures of the double life he led, undone by his own arrogance and the corrosive habits he used to cope. His life reveals the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of so many grand ideological struggles. The individual, no matter how gifted or loyal, is ultimately an expendable asset in the cold, inhuman machinery of the state. In the end, Richard Sorge is a ghost in more ways than one. He is a ghost of the German Empire he fought for and then rejected, a ghost of the Nazi regime he infiltrated and betrayed, and a ghost of the Soviet system he served and was abandoned by. He exists in the spaces between these worlds, a figure of profound ambiguity. He was a hero who saved his country, a traitor who sold out another, a martyr to a cause, and a victim of its supreme indifference. His final, tragic legacy is not just in the intelligence he gathered, but in the chilling questions his life and death force us to ask about the price of loyalty, the meaning of sacrifice, and the human cost of a world built on secrets and lies. He gave everything for his faith, only to learn in the final, agonizing moments that his faith was in a God that had never truly cared if he lived or died.